a kid named Jimmy Livingston is brought into the world with no immunity at all. Even a little microbe can kill him, so he must be kept in isolation. He can't touch anything without it being disinfected. Thus, he must live inside a bubble-like plastic sphere for his entire life to survive. His mother, Mrs. Livingston, is overprotective of her son. Until he was 4 years old, he wasn't even allowed to come home. However, after he turned 4, she and Mr. Livingston bring the young boy home in his bubble. His room also has a large bubble, so he can walk inside it. The bubble has a few protruded hands that his parents can use to touch him. All his toys are sterilized to be free from the smallest of the germs and kept inside the bubble. Jimmy has lived in that room ever since. Mrs. Livingston never wants him to leave the bubble, so she ends all the bedtime stories with the princess dying because they were let free. He is only allowed to watch one television channel and read one magazine since Mrs. Livingston insists they are the only ones created. She also uses the protruded arms to cut his hair and hug her son. Mrs. Livingston is a super patriot, so she teaches Jimmy only the things she thinks are reasonable and forces her ideas on him. However, poor Jimmy knows no better, so he goes along with it. Everyone in the town knows about the special bubble boy, but it doesn't do him any good. Instead, the neighbor kids wrap themselves in cling film and make fun of Jimmy outside his house. Mrs. Livingston chases them away daily. The only food Jimmy eats is homemade. A purification system has been set in a plastic tube, where Mrs. Livingston puts his food to kill the germs before Jimmy can take it. Jimmy is now 16 years old. He narrates that he grew up like any other kid and is happy when he gets an electrical guitar instead of a car. Until one day, he is at his window when he sees a new girl his age named Chloe moving into his neighborhood. He has grown to like the girl but can't do anything about it. Moreover, he is clueless about love or girls. His mother senses his obsession and tells the story to Jimmy about a boy who died because he touched the local tramp. For the next few years, Jimmy watches Chloe through his windows a lot. She also sees him watching her. He narrates that he knows something is happening to him, but he doesn't know what. One morning, he wakes up with an erection and is terrified. Unaware of the concept, he hits himself with a bat, cries and calls his mother. Mrs. Livingston comes in and makes him repeat the Pledge of Allegiance until he calms down. Chloe has a group of popular friends who make fun of Jimmy, calling him the bubble boy. She seems to be protective towards him. One day, she knocks on the Livingston's door, and Mr. Livingston lets her in. She sees the arrangement of plastic tubes all around the house and is fascinated. She follows the tube and reaches Jimmy's room. Jimmy is surprised and nervous because his mother is the only woman he has talked to. Chloe talks to him and tells him she likes his guitar. Jimmy tries teaching her to play it with the protruded hands. He starts reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in it. Starting that day, the two hang out together every day. Mrs. Livingston doesn't like their friendship, but can't seem to do anything about it. A montage of them hanging out follows. She gives him a guinea pig inside a ball for his birthday, and even brings kids inside his space for Halloween. One night, on her birthday, a drunk Chloe slips inside Jimmy's room through the windows. She tries getting inside the bubble, claiming she can't resist him anymore, but she passes out before she can go in. The scene cuts to Chloe's prom night. Her jock boyfriend, Mark, comes to get her, and Jimmy is heartbroken. Mark offers Jimmy a cigarette, but he doesn't know what it is. One night, Jimmy sees Mark and Chloe make out through his windows. The very next day, Chloe comes into Jimmy's room and shows him her engagement ring. Mark had proposed to her to marry him. Their marriage is this weekend at Niagara Falls, and she has come to inform Jimmy. Jimmy is disappointed, but doesn't show it on his face. She has also brought him a gift, which she keeps inside his sterilization tube, but Jimmy ignores it. Instead, he gives her the guinea pig back and asks her to go away. Chloe leaves with tears in her eyes. Later, Jimmy opens the gift and sees it is a snow globe with "I love you" written inside. Surprised, he yells her name and decides to go to Niagara Falls to stop the wedding. He works hard to make himself a portable bubble shield and is finally successful. Then, he sneaks out of the house without his parents knowing. Jimmy is happy to be running for the first time. He reaches the bus station and asks the person there for a bus ticket. However, Jimmy has forgotten to bring any money. Annoyed, he tries to cross the road when he is hit by a bus. He goes flying to the ground, but his bubble saves him. People from the bus come out and offer to give him a ride. Jimmy happily accepts it, but he gets to know that the people are part of a religious cult. When he points it out, they angrily throw him out of the bus. The cult group reaches their destination, where their leader announces a round man inside a globe to be the savior sent by God. The group realizes that Jimmy was their savior and sets out to look for him to take him out of the globe. Meanwhile, Jimmy meets a biker named Slim. Jimmy tells him about his first love, marrying someone else. Slim is impressed and in turn tells him of his ex-girlfriend who he still loves named Wildfire. He then offers Jimmy a ride, and they both make their way to Niagara Falls. At home, Mrs. Livingston finds Jimmy missing and goes crazy. Mrs. Livingston and her husband set out to search for Jimmy because the police would only do it after 24 hours of the disappearance. Elsewhere, Slim and Jimmy reach Vegas and stop to rest. They have lots of fun at a casino, but Jimmy only hours before the wedding. So, he leaves Slim at the club, takes a motorcycle, and rides away in it. After going for a while, Jimmy comes across his parents' car, who tries to stop him from running. In a hurry, Jimmy gets into an accident, but fortunately, his bubble bounces him into a running train. He escapes his mother, but is now trapped in a train with freaks from a freak show. The freaks tell him about their leader, Dr. Freak, who keeps them trapped and uses them in his freak show. Jimmy meets Dr. Freak, who is a dwarf. He accidentally throws the man to the ground with his bubble and frees the other freaks. Then, he continues his way to Niagara Falls. However, he can hardly use a motorcycle anymore, so he goes to a diner to ask someone for a ride. At the diner, a lot of cops menace a man named Pushpa. When Jimmy tells them he has no immunity, they assume Jimmy has an infectious disease and flee the place. In the chaos, the diner catches fire, and Pushpa offers Jimmy a ride, agreeing to take him to Niagara Falls. Elsewhere, Mrs. Livingston reaches Dr. Freak, who tells her that Jimmy is heading to Niagara Falls. Furious, she calls Chloe and shouts at her for making Jimmy run away. While she's talking with Dr. Freak, the freaks outside take her car. Pushbop and Jimmy are on their way when they hit a cow in the road. Pushbop is upset because, in his religion, cows are a symbol of God. However, remembering his mother's words, Jimmy tells him that his religion is false. This offends Pushbop, so he leaves Jimmy on his own. Jimmy somehow reaches New York and asks an elderly man named Pippi for a ride, to which Pippi agrees. Jimmy wakes up the next morning and finds the man still driving the car. He soon realizes that Pippi is lying lifeless, and the car hits a billboard. Jimmy goes into a supermarket and calls Chloe. Mark answers the phone and tells Jimmy to give up, as he is about to marry Chloe in an hour. Feeling despondent, Jimmy calls his mom and asks her to come and get him. Both his parents drive to him and get him inside the car. While Mrs. Livingston goes to the restroom, Mr. Livingston asks Jimmy how it felt to be outside for the first time. The father and son bond, and Mr. Livingston tells Jimmy not to give up before trying. Taking his father's words to heart, Jimmy runs to stop the wedding. Mrs. Livingston sees this and follows him in their car. Simultaneously, the cult group finds Jimmy and follows him too. Slim, with his biker friends, also comes to rescue Jimmy. Slim stares at Mrs. Livingston, who is his old love, Wildfire. It turns out they're all driving on a plane's runway. A plane takes off, and Jimmy gets a ride with an old pilot. They fly to Niagara Falls, but the plane crashes, causing Jimmy to fall into the cascade. Fortunately, his bubble keeps him from drowning. He somehow manages to get out of the water and rushes to the wedding. Chloe and Mark are in the chapel, saying their vows, when Jimmy bursts into the church, declaring his love for her. Seeing this as his last chance to win Chloe over, he risks his life and tears his bubble open to kiss her. However, just after the kiss, he falls unconscious. As Chloe tries to wake him, Mr. and Mrs. Livingston arrive. Mrs. Livingston mourns her son's death, when Mr. Livingston asks her to tell the truth. Embarrassingly, Mrs. Livingston reveals that Jimmy has no condition, and he suddenly wakes up. It turns out she had lied to him for so long to keep him away from the evils of the world. Jimmy is shocked but forgives his mother when she claims she did it to protect him. He finally embraces Chloe as everyone applauds. Cut to a few months later. Chloe and Jimmy are getting married. Everyone he met during his journey is at the wedding. Mr. Livingston, Mrs. Livingston, and Slim are now a throuple. The story ends as we see Jimmy and Chloe drive away in a car to their honeymoon.